Hello and welcome to assignment writing for the new RQF Higher Nationals. My name is Jeffrey Maxtudis. I'm the subject lead for Art and Design, Construction and Creative Media at Pearson, and I'll be taking you through this training today. Today we're going to look at understanding the principles behind the assessment and assignment writing for the new RQF Higher Nationals. We'll review approaches to assignment design and assessment. We'll have a look at developing assignment briefs that are mapped to learning outcomes and assessment criteria. We'll have an overview of the documentation requirements for assignment briefs, and we'll look at the internal verification processes. For those of you who haven't yet had a chance to look at the new RQF Higher Nationals, these are a completely new suite of qualifications. We've updated the curriculum, brought it into line with new technologies and new pedagogies. That includes extending the qualification to make sure that we're covering different learning platforms, whether that's full-time, part-time, online, blended learning, flipped classroom, and so on. Employability skills and transferable skills are embedded throughout the qualification. We've taken great care to make sure that students are prepared for both university progression and employment. We have new quality assurance measures that really bring the Higher Nationals into line with general HE practice within the UK. And there's a comprehensive support package available, including example assessment briefs, schemes of work, and various other resources. And we continue to expand that as we roll out new qualifications. So let's have a quick look at grading and assessment and reassessment. For those familiar with the Higher Nationals, you'll be familiar with the mastery model of assessment. This is developed by Benjamin Bloom, best known for his taxonomy that's often used in education. And it's based on the principle that students must achieve a level of mastery in knowledge or skill in order to progress to higher levels. In practice in the Higher Nationals, this means that a student must achieve an evidence achievement of all the required learning at a level and below in order to be awarded the grade. So what this means is that for a student to achieve, for example, a distinction, they must also achieve merit and pass. So the student has to achieve all levels at and below the level of the grade. So for merit, it's merit and pass, and so on. This is not new. This has been the case for Higher Nationals for some time. For those of you who have been working in Higher Nationals for a while, the change in reassessment policy. A student who, for the first assessment, does not achieve a pass can be offered the opportunity for a reassessment. Now, this means that students cannot be offered a reassessment if they have achieved a pass. Reassessment of coursework and portfolio work and so on will typically be continuing the work from the original task, updating, completing, so on. Where you may be using examination, you'll have to develop a new task, a new assignment for the student. A student who undertakes a reassessment will have their grade capped at pass. You cannot get higher than a pass on a reassessment. Similarly, if a student fails that reassessment, they may be offered the opportunity to retake the unit in full. Another new development is the introduction of compensation. This allows a student to request compensation for failed units at level 4 and level 5 up to 15 credits at each of those levels. This does mean it's possible to achieve the Higher National certificate on 105 credits rather than 120, and it's possible to achieve the HND, the Higher National Diploma, on 210 credits rather than 240. However, what's important to recognize, and what you'll need to work with your students to recognize, is that this is not a strategy, because the fact that the students don't have 120 credits at level 4 or 240 credits at the HND level will have an implication. So for example, if your center has an internal progression policy that says a student to progress from level 4 to level 5 must have 120 credits at level 4, then that student will not be able to progress to level 5. Similarly, most universities will be looking for 120 or 240 credits, depending on the qualification the student's coming with. And if the student doesn't have those credits, they're going to be faced with either not being made an offer for university, or they will have to recover those credits elsewhere. The other thing that students have to understand is that they have to have fully attempted and completed the unit. You can't simply hand in a piece of paper with your name on it and ask to be compensated. The student has to have attempted all the work, completed all the work, but has failed. Typically, you're going to want to have conversations with the students about reassessment and retake before the student starts to think about compensation. And keep in mind that compensation is a request that the student makes. It is not an automatic, and it is a decision to be taken by the exam board or the assessment board. It's not a decision that should be taken by an individual tutor to make that offer. Formative assessment is now quite an important part of what you'll be working with students on through the RQF. Keep in mind that formative assessment is developmental. You're helping students to develop their learning and develop their performance. It's offered prior to summative assessment. And what you're trying to do is help students to develop and consolidate their knowledge and skills and so on. Formative assessment does not directly contribute to the final grade awarded for the unit. It's developmental. And what you really have to be careful of with your formative assessment is that you're not coaching students. You're not giving them an advice on specifically what to do in order to achieve a grade at summative assessment. There is a change to the overall qualification grading. If you recall, under the QCF, a pass did not have any points associated with it. So pass did not contribute to the overall achievement of a merit or distinction. We've now changed that, and a pass carries 4 points. So for each credit awarded at pass level, the student gets 4 points. This is quite important, particularly when you take into account the reassessment requirements, so that if a student takes a reassessment, they can only achieve a pass. For a student, particularly at the beginning of their higher national, that may seem like a pretty tough thing. But what we can now talk to the student about is the fact that that pass still is an achievement and it still counts towards something. So it's possible to achieve an overall merit or an overall distinction through a combination of pass, merit, and distinction grades. One of the big changes to the new higher nationals is the shift to a holistic assessment. So let's look at that in more detail. When we talk about assessment, we have a number of different kinds of assessment. At one end, we have a task-driven assessment. At the other end, we have a holistic assessment. And one level, we're looking at performance against criteria. At the other, we're exercising academic judgment. At the moment, the QCF is somewhere down here, assessment of tasks using assessment criteria. What we want to move to is holistic assessment. So that's our trajectory. We're moving from the QCF at assessment of tasks to the RQF with a holistic assessment approach. One way to think about this is if we were asking a student to prepare a meal, to prepare a hamburger, and these were the things that we were going to assess, it really wouldn't make sense to start to tie specific parts of that assessment to specific parts of the burger, because selection of ingredients is not just the bun. Skill in preparation is not just the onions. Taste is not the cheese. Presentation is not the burger alone. What we're looking at is we want to assess all of these against all of this. We want to look at it in the whole. And that's where we're looking at holistic assessment. So when we talk about holistic assessment, we're talking about the tutor exercising academic judgments on grading based on the assignment as a whole. It's quite common in HE practice, works well in professional judgment models and so on. In the higher nationals, we're a kind of hybrid where we're exercising some professional judgment, but it is also rooted in an analytical process which uses the learning outcomes and the assessment criteria. However, keep in mind that even though we're looking at an analytical approach as well, it is not the case that we need to have individual tasks associated with individual learning outcomes or assessment criteria. We're looking at it holistically. We can use things that span across and combine. So let's look in detail at our unit's learning outcomes and assessment criteria. We have new unit descriptors. This is an example here. And the teaching and learning strategy of the new higher nationals is based on a balance of knowledge and skills. As I've mentioned before, embedding employability skills is something that we've worked very hard on. It's interesting that when we talk to a lot of employers and ask them what do they see missing in graduates coming to work for them, they don't often talk about technical skills. They talk a great deal about employability skills. They talk about young people not necessarily understanding what it's like to be in employment, not understanding how to communicate professionally or behave in a professional manner. And so we've really tried to make sure that those key employability skills are embedded throughout. The other thing that's in the development model is this idea of CAP skills, the cognitive, the affective, the psychomotor. And if we look at that in a little more detail, what we're talking about is cognitive skills being mental skills. They're about knowledge of the subject. Affective skills being the emotional skills or behaviors associated with the subject. And again, that's where our employability skills and professional behaviors come in. And then the psychomotor being the physical manual skills. Having knowledge, how do we embody that knowledge? What do we do with it? How do we put it into a form that others can engage with? And so when we look at the unit descriptors, we see the introduction. We've worked hard to make sure that the introductions are clear and precise. They're not about trying to show how clever the writer of the unit is. It's about being clear about what the unit is about and what the student can be expected to engage in. By and large, you will find that there are around 4 learning outcomes per unit in the new higher nationals. In some cases, you might find 3. In some cases, you might find 5. But 4 is by far the highest average within the qualification. And the approach to those learning outcomes really follows this CAP skills principle that we have learning outcomes that cycle students through cognitive, affective, and psychomotor skills. And the construction of those learning outcomes is really about shifting toward this holistic approach to delivery and assessment. The next part of the new unit descriptors is the essential content. Essential content is the topics and subtopics that we define as being required for students to be engaged in order to achieve the learning outcome. So the italic is the topic, the non-italic are subtopics. So that is the content that the student must be taught in order to achieve that learning outcome. The content, we think, because by and large we're talking about lists, is more flexible. We're not telling you how to deliver this. We're not telling you what is the most important. The essential content is not weighted or hierarchical. So this topic is not more important than this topic. You, as the tutor, as the center, will determine what is the greatest focus for you in helping students to achieve this learning outcome. And keep in mind that this essential content is not a limit. If there are things that you feel the students should engage with in relation to that learning outcome, by all means you may add to it, but it isn't expected that you'll be assessing that. And in fact, the expectation is not that all of this content is assessed. We're assessing the learning outcome, not the content. When we look at the assessment criteria, one of the big changes that you may recognize is that we now define merit and distinction as well as pass within the unit, where previously pass was defined, merit and distinction, centers would contextualize themselves. It's now the case that we expect contextualization is happening at the point of delivery, at the point of engaging students with that essential content. And therefore, the learning outcomes and assessment criteria are defined for everyone. This is a big change, um, but it also allows us to make sure that what we're doing is we're using those pass criteria to set the threshold that the student must meet to achieve the learning outcome. And then merit and distinction go into greater depth and breadth of knowledge and understanding. Now, one thing to look at is that in most cases you'll find 2 or 3 pass criteria per learning outcome, 1 or 2 merit criteria, and no more than 1 distinction criteria per learning outcome. However, in some cases, as in this, you will see that distinction criteria sometimes span across learning outcomes. And this is because when students are operating at distinction level, they are often bringing together bodies of knowledge and different skill sets. And we want to be able to assess that relationship between those and help the student to recognize that relationship between areas of learning. The other thing we've worked very hard to make clear is that because we're assessing at learning outcome level, and we'll talk more about that in a few minutes, um, the criteria all have to relate to the learning outcome. We're not talking about criteria which are different. The criteria should build from the learning outcome. We should identify within those criteria aspects of the learning outcome. And the scaffolding principle that we use is about trying to make sure that all through, from pass to merit to distinction, there is a single activity that the student may engage with. So what we're doing is we're thinking about what is the student doing in relation to that learning outcome, and how do these criteria allow us to evaluate their achievement of that learning outcome. We shouldn't be asking the student to do something fundamentally different at merit level than they were doing at distinction or at pass level. And similarly, at distinction level, we should not be asking the student to do something different again. And we should see that the pass builds to the merit builds to the distinction. So if a student is working at distinction level, because of that scaffolding principle, they should have already been engaged in the merit and the pass. So, as I mentioned before, in RQF, assessment is at learning outcome level. We are not assessing individual criteria, we are assessing learning outcomes. The learning outcome describes what the student must be able to do at the point at which they are assessed. The learning outcomes have assessment criteria, and the assessment criteria allow us to define or identify the level to which the student has achieved the learning outcome. And that's the real fundamental point about assessment and assignment writing for the RQF, is that we're looking at achievement of learning outcomes and the level of that achievement through the assessment criteria. Again, we're not looking at writing assignments that have individual tasks for each criteria. We're looking at assignments that assess the learning outcome or multiple learning outcomes together. When we talk about different types of assessment, we're looking generally at 3 kinds of assessment. We have the single unit assessment, which looks at all the learning outcomes in a unit through one assignment. We have the single unit staged assessment, which looks at 2 or more assignments for a unit, and those may be assessed at different times. However, one thing to keep in mind is that if you're doing single unit staged assessment and you've got those assessments coming in at different times, you need to make really sure that the assignment early in that cycle is appropriate. If you have a 10-week unit and you're going to have the first assessment in week 3, the student must be able to achieve pass, merit, or distinction at week 3 in relation to that learning outcome. Because if they can only achieve pass because the assessment is set at too high a level for what could be achieved in 3 weeks, the student will then be stuck at pass because the unit award will be based on the lowest assessment. So if a student achieves pass in that first assessment, they cannot achieve anything beyond a pass for the overall unit. That goes back to that mastery model of assessment. So if you're using single unit staged assessment, be very careful to make sure that you are constructing the opportunity for the student to achieve pass, merit, or distinction in each of those individual assessments. The third type is the integrated assessment, and this looks at using learning outcome and criteria for more than one unit through a single assignment. Now, this might be 2 units or 3 units or more, but they will be assessed together. It's a very, very good, very holistic approach to assessment, but obviously it has some logistical challenges around unit delivery and assessment. If you are going to be looking at an integrated approach to assessment, looking at multiple units assessed together, you need to make sure you're taking a holistic view of the program and thinking about what will be beneficial for the student. Integrated assessments where you may be looking at one assignment against multiple units is not intended to make it easier for you. It's intended to create more opportunity and be beneficial for the student. So consider that relationship between units. Make sure that your content and assessment methods underpin the relationship between those units, and that the type of assessment, the type of assignment are appropriate to the multiple units you're dealing with. Make sure that you're mapping assessment evidence across, and try to create multiple opportunities for the student to achieve the learning outcomes. Um, there may be instances where through one assignment, a student might have multiple opportunities to show you evidence against the learning outcomes. So, what are assignments? Well, an assignment is an assessment tool. It's something we ask the student to do in order to produce evidence that we can assess. And it's designed to allow the student to demonstrate knowledge, skill, and understanding. It needs to be based on an appropriate assessment activity. Yeah. So the type of assignment, a report, an essay, presentation, and so on, need to map and relate to the type of learning that the student's been engaged in. And we're very proactive now about basing that on a vocational scenario or context. As a vocational qualification, we want students to constantly be engaging with the fact that this is a professionally related qualification. When we think about assessment evidence, we have to make sure that it allows certain things. It must be valid, it must provide clarity in how the evidence will relate to the knowledge and skills, and how that can be assessed. It has to provide sufficient evidence for the student to show achievement at pass, merit, or distinction. Again, we're not assessing multiple times to go from pass to merit to distinction. We're assessing once, and through that assessment, we should be able to see the student achieve at pass, merit, or distinction. It has to allow students to show their own achievement. It has to be authentic. That would normally be the primary goal. However, you will always have instances where students are relying on work of others, and they need to understand the authenticity and evidence their understanding of the authenticity of others as well. So that's you're looking at referencing and so on. Appropriate, providing sufficient scope for the student to evidence their full achievement, and relevant. It needs to relate to the subject content and that vocational context. If the assignment is relevant, if the assessment evidence is relevant, related to that vocational context, the students will engage with it more readily. They will identify the fact that it has real meaning, real value to their future ambitions. Now, there are many, many types of evidence that we could ask for in writing assignments. The important thing is to recognize what those are and how they're used. Here we've got a quick table that looks at some different types of assessment and how they might allow us to see achievement of different types of those CAP skills. So let's look at developing assignment briefs. The unit assignment brief is really based on three things. We have our learning outcomes and their associated assessment criteria and the level. The level is crucial. We need to make sure that the student is working at the level at which they're studying. We shouldn't be writing assignments that are too low or too high for the student. They need to be able to work at that level in order that we can assess their achievement at that level. So when you're planning an assignment, think about the teaching and learning strategy that you've been working with in the delivery. Whether that's for a single unit or multiple units, there will be a direct relationship between how you've been engaging with the students around delivery and the type of assessment. If you've been doing a unit which is very practical, then your assessment probably needs to be something that allows the students to evidence that practical engagement. Consider the different types of assessment methods that are available, choosing the one that is going to be most appropriate, most relevant for the student and for the unit. That should also be in relation to the overall program. Students need to have a varied menu of assessment types in their study. One of the things that we've often heard is that students might get to a university top-up and find that they're asked to do a kind of assignment or a form of assessment that they've never engaged in before. So as much as possible, we should try to take students through a variety of different types of assignment, different types of assessment, so that they're getting some exposure to that. It will also make the students' experience more interesting, that they're not constantly doing the same type of assessment, engaging in the same type of assignment. They're having different types of work that they're asked to do. Plan the number of assignments to be used in a unit or group of units. Think about that also in relation to other units that the student may be engaged in. We need to make sure that we're not overloading the student with multiple assignments that might be due in close proximity to each other, because the number of assignments that the student has to complete at the same time will have an impact on their achievement. Keep in mind the resource implications of the assessment. If you were delivering a 3D modeling course that required students to use facilities within the college, because that's where the software is, you have to make sure that the students will have sufficient access to those resources to be able to complete their work. Make sure you're building in the opportunities to achieve the higher levels in the assessment. The student must be given the opportunity to achieve at pass, merit, or distinction. Ideally, they'll always be up at those higher levels. If they don't hit those higher levels, that scaffolding principle should mean that they'll hit one of the lower levels. But they must have that opportunity. Again, we should not be thinking about writing assignments that only allow a student to achieve a pass. It's pass, merit, or distinction for the assignment. When you write the assignment brief, be clear about what the student must do. Be clear about the evidence that they have to provide. Include the learning outcomes associated with the assignment brief. So if we're doing a single unit assessment, all 4 learning outcomes being assessed through one assignment, then all 4 learning outcomes will appear in that assignment brief. If we're doing single unit staged assessment, where we might have 4 assignments, each corresponding to the learning outcomes, then the brief for individual assignments will show that learning outcome that's being assessed. Make sure that you're using the same or similar operative verbs, those command verbs, that you find in the assessment criteria. And we'll look at an example of this in a moment. Present a vocational scenario that's meaningful to the student. Rather than just tell the student what they have to do, build a scenario around it which puts it into a professional context. Help the student recognize how the work that they're doing in college is modeling a professional experience that they will have in the future. That scenario is really important. It should be clearly linked to the vocational context of the subject. It should put the student into an identified role, and that role needs to be appropriate to their level. I recently did a session with some colleagues in construction, and we asked them to write a vocational scenario, and somebody said, "You are a civil engineer." Well, this is a level 4 unit, the team we're working on. So the student isn't a civil engineer, and they may not be a civil engineer for 5 or more years. So the level of that role was not appropriate. Think about what a student might be doing after level 4, after level 5. What kind of role might they be working in? And build around that role. Your scenario should communicate real world issues and challenges faced in the workplace. Make it something that the student will identify with, that they can see that that's something I might have to deal with in my professional life. Challenge the student to act professionally. If you're asking the student to give a presentation, don't say you will give a presentation to your colleagues in class. Say that you will give a presentation to the board of directors. While the student may still be delivering that presentation to other students and tutors, the fact that you put it into that context means the student has to think about and engage with questions about what is a professional presentation? How do I present to senior members of a company? Make sure that the activity that you're building into your scenario and into your assignment allows the student to engage with cognitive, affective, and psychomotor skills. Make sure you're presenting it in a language that's appropriate to the level and the vocational context. All of that forms the main part of what you would put into your assessment brief and guidance section of the assignment brief. Another thing to think about is how can you build in external links? As a vocational qualification, we want students to be constantly working in relation to the professions. So think about how you can bring that in. So, for example, you might set that assignment with a really strong vocational context. You may engage with local employers as guest speakers or as part of the assessment team, sitting on panels and so on. You might have a live case study or a live project where a local employer gives you information that you can use to construct that assignment. Work placements, teacher placements are also something that can be a very good way of keeping those external links coming back in. If you have opportunities for staff to go out and work in the industry, then they bring that expertise back in and can engage with the students around those professional contexts. So let's look at an example. This is from the Creative Media Production Qualification, Specialist Journalism Unit. And you can see that the submission format states very clearly that the assignment is in 3 parts, tells you what they are, in some cases gives you the relative size of what we're expecting. All 4 learning outcomes are presented here, which means that this is a single unit assessment. And then this is the brief. Now, for those of you who've worked in the QCF for a while, you will recognize that this is quite different because we're not giving the student a series of tasks based on the individual assessment criteria. We're presenting the student with a holistic description of the assignment, what they're going to be doing. And if we look through this, we start to see a few things. So the student is working as a stringer. For those of you not familiar with journalism, a stringer is like a freelance journalist for a major publisher of specialist magazines. So we've got a role, we've got a context. We go on. These magazines are published in print, online, through audio and video content. So we're giving some more context to what the student might be engaged in. And as we go on and we look at the different parts of what they're asked to prepare, we see that a clear explanation of the research. This should also compare, evaluate, indication of media format, selected format, research and analysis, exploration, editing and revision, industry standards and conventions, diverse sources, coherent, identified audience. Now, what's interesting here is that when we look at the learning outcomes and assessment criteria, we're starting to see some of that same language being pulled out of the criteria and brought into the assignment brief so that the student starts to identify where pass, merit, and distinction may be found in that description. So we see explain, compare, discuss, evaluate, critically evaluate, research and analysis, media output, justify. So we don't have to give the student a list of tasks. We can describe the work. We can give them something that might be closer to a professional brief, an explanation that a client might ask for. And the student needs to develop skills around interpreting that and identifying where they need to pitch their quality and achievement. So we can use this as a way of challenging the student to develop some of those professional skills. When you're writing your assignment briefs, there are some things that you mustn't do. You should not change the wording of the learning outcomes or assessment criteria. Those are defined in the qualification, and therefore that's a kind of contract between Pearson, the college, and the student. You should not be adding your own assessment criteria. The assessment criteria are defined and they must be as presented in the specification. If you're asking the students to engage in examinations or controlled assessments, make sure that you're using question types that are appropriate to the level. So we suggest that multiple choice, fill in the missing word types of activities are not appropriate. Do not use those. Remember that grading is pass, merit, and distinction. There is no numerical marking or percentage weighting in higher nationals. The student should never be presented with a grade other than pass, merit, or distinction. Do not impose word counts or limits as a way of punishing the student. These are there as recommendations. They cannot be the basis on which you define pass, merit, or distinction, or fail. Often you'll see in our example assessments comments like, while there is a word count defined for this assignment, you will not be penalized for exceeding this word count. However, keep in mind that professional writing is benchmarked by clarity and precision. Documents which are longer than necessary do not reflect a professional approach. So if you were assessing a student and one of the things that you were assessing was a learning outcome that said to prepare a professional report, and you said that the word limit is 2,500 words, and a student gives you 5,000, you're not marking them down because they gave you 5,000 words. You're potentially marking against the fact that the document is longer than required, and therefore it's not clear, it's not precise, it's not professional. If you have a word count and the student gives you substantially less than the word count, that in and of itself is not sufficient reason to fail the student. However, if you've defined a word count that's 1,000 words, the expectation is that the student needs 1,000 words in order to provide you with evidence. If they're only giving you 200, you shouldn't be able to find the evidence for pass, merit, or distinction. I've talked a bit before about example assessment briefs, but we also have example schemes of work, and these are available for every unit in the new RQF qualifications. They're available as PDFs and Microsoft Word documents, and you'll find those on the Pearson qualification website and on HN Global. These are available to you to use as examples, inspiration, and so on. The expectation is not for you to use these as assignments. They're there for you to look at and get ideas of how an assignment for a particular unit might be put together, how it might be structured. Keep in mind that you must go through your standard moderation and internal verification process.
Welcome to HN Global, Pearson's first online platform for BTech Higher National students around the world. With HN Global, students can get access to course-specific core textbooks, work on their CV, improve their study skills by completing online learning modules, and so much more. Signing up to HN Global is very simple. Just click on Create Account, fill in your details, create a memorable password, choose your center from the drop-down list, and choose your subject, and you will have instant free access. Once you have created an account, you will have access to the HN Global dashboard. In order to access the core textbooks, you need to create a free account. The Business Core textbook provides students with key resources to develop their knowledge and understanding of the core units. It contains selections from market-leading textbooks specifically chosen to cover the core units. By signing into our career services sections, students can build their CV, find job hunting techniques, take a look at the international jobs board, take a practice test, complete practice interviews, learn to recognize their skills, and much, much more. Starting a new course can be challenging, and it can be difficult to know where to start. Students can go to the study skills section to brush up on their academic skills by taking one of our study skills modules. Pearson has created these modules in areas such as essay and report writing, giving effective presentations, and the critical thinking to ensure students hit the ground running. The forum is a place for students and tutors to engage in conversation, ask questions about their subject, and chat with peers from around the world. Most importantly, our dedicated team at Pearson will always be there to answer any questions you might have. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact us by filling in the form or emailing us at support@highernationals.com.
So as you can see, HN Global, which is our new online platform, has quite a lot of material to support you and your students. At the moment, there's a great deal of resource there for students, and we're building up the tutor side as well with additional training like this and others. Again, if you have any questions about HN Global, please contact support@highernationals.com. Internal verification. Internal verification is the process by which we make sure that the assignment is suitable for students, provides them with all the opportunities to achieve at pass, merit, and distinction, it's clear, and so on. And after the assessment, we confirm that the grading has been appropriate and that feedback is appropriate. So within that diagram that you see there, there are a couple of points where you may be cycling back through. You prepare your assignment, you have your internal verifier look at it, they'll have some comments, so you'll go back to modify the assignment, and then go back to internal verification again. Keep in mind that internal verification of the assignment brief must be completed before it's issued to the students. You've then got your assessment process, and you'll have your internal verification. At this point, you're not looking at everything. You're probably looking at a sample of the assessment results and feedback. And again, you may have some comments from the internal verifier, which means you need to go back and have a look at grading or adjust some feedback and so on. And again, internal verification should be completed before the assessment board and before the results are issued to students. Internal verification is a center-wide process. You need to have a clear, documented process that conforms across your entire center. It needs to be well managed and systematic. It needs to be timely. Again, you want to make sure that you're getting your assignments prepared and engaging with your internal verification process well before you're going to issue it to the students. There's nothing worse than having to rush through that process just before issuing it to the students. You have to monitor that process, make sure that you've got a clear documentation trail, because it's part of your external examiner's job to look at your internal verification processes. So you'll need to have evidence of that. And it should be a supportive, not non-threatening process. It's two colleagues having a discussion. It doesn't involve the student, but it's developmental. Your internal verification should be constantly working to make assignments better every time you do it. When we look at the internal verification of the assignment brief, what we're looking at is the assignment evidence, is the assignment guidance and evidence clear to the student? Are the associated learning outcomes included? Is the language and the level appropriate? Is it got a clear vocational context? And we really encourage you to make that a key part of your internal verification process, making sure that there's a vocationally relevant context and scenario that underpins the assignment. Make sure that if there are recommendations from the internal verifier that those are actioned, and you'll need to sign and date all your documentation and keep those records, whether it's paper-based or electronic. You need that audit trail for your external examiner. After the assessment has taken place, you've got your internal verification of the assessed work and the assessment feedback. And here's an example of one of the forms that you might see. One of the things that we want you to think about is that just as we're pushing toward holistic assessment and assignments that present a holistic way of the student engaging, so too should the feedback from the assessment be holistic, so that you're not giving assessment feedback against each and every criteria. You're giving the student an overall view of the assessment and how that's gone. You may, just as you are in writing your assignment, you may want to pull in some of the language from the criteria, but what you're really trying to do is give the student that overall understanding of what's been achieved, what still needs to work, and what they can do to continue to improve. This concept of feed forward, so that through the assessment, the student is identifying what they've done well, what they need to work on, and how to continue to improve for the future. Clearly, assessment requires planning, and you also need to think about recording that process, making sure that you're tracking progress and so on. Both the way that the center is developing, but also the way the student is progressing through their assessment activities. So plan your timetable of assessment activities. Make sure that the evidence requirements are there. You've got target completion dates and so on. And again, in planning your assessment, don't just think about individual units. Think about the overall program. Think about the other things the student is engaged with. Make sure you're completing your internal verification prior to the assignment being issued to the students. It is a requirement that the assignment is verified prior to the student beginning. Track and record all the assessment activities for the qualification on a unit by unit basis. This is probably a spreadsheet or a database that allows you to track individual students and their achievement so that you have a clear idea of the student's profile in assessment. Now, there are some key documents that will help you in this process. There is the Center Guide for Managing Quality. This is the 2016-17. There will be an updated version coming out for 17-18. This is the guide that helps you ensure that you've got all of your necessary policies in place. Guide to Quality and Assessment, whether the UK guide or the international guide, is really the heart of where you will find all of the specific policies and requirements around assessment. So any of your questions about grading or reassessment or compensation are all found in the Guide to Quality and Assessment. All of your decisions around reassessment, retake, and so on need to be developed in relation to your mitigating or extenuating circumstances policy, and there are some key documents to help you in developing those policies. One of them is from the Joint Council for Qualifications, and then there's some supplementary guidance from Pearson that will help you to look at how to develop those policies for your center. As I've said, lots of support material available. The specifications, example assessment briefs, sample schemes of work, those are all available on the Pearson Qualifications website at that address and also on the HN Global at that address. We continue to offer a commissioned higher national service, and this runs from anything from developing a completely bespoke qualification to developing specific units for your center. There are instances where, because of specific local needs, you need a unit that we haven't developed, and we can work with you on that. As you can see, typically you can have up to 30 credits at HNC and 30 credits at HND can be locally devised units. There is also what's called Meeting Local Needs, or MLN, which allows you to import units from other regulated qualifications. So, for example, if you wanted to develop a art and design qualification that had some very specific business-related units around marketing, you could import marketing units from the RQF business qualification and add those in as optional units into your higher national for art and design. If you have any questions about that, I'll give you the contact for our commissioned service. So we have various contacts. As you can see, we have a general queries email there. If you have questions about commissioned, there's the email address for that. Queries around HN Global, you can go to HN Global at Pearson, or again, support at Higher Nationals. And if you have quality assurance queries, you can contact our quality assurance team directly. We have lots of face-to-face and other online training available. These are typically scheduled at different points, but centers can request specific sessions, or we can develop bespoke training for you. If you have any questions about training opportunities available with Pearson, please contact Josie Afalabi, our training operations manager, and she can talk to you about what's coming up or talk to you about bespoke training for your center. We really encourage you to sign up for the Higher Nationals newsletter. There's the link that you can go to find that. It looks like that to sign up. And this will subscribe you to our newsletter. It comes out every couple of months, and that's where we will let you know about new developments, new resources available, training schedules, and so on. So please do make sure that everybody or some key people in your team are signing up for the Higher Nationals newsletter. So thank you very much. And if you have any questions, please do get in touch with us, and I will say goodbye.